The day Maren Solberg stood in the Kellner Grange Hall with 700 fat hogs behind her and a county full of hungry people in front of her. The room was so quiet you could hear the January wind working at the caulking on the window frames. Men who had laughed at her 18 months ago sat with their hats in their laps and their eyes on the floor. Women who had shaken their heads at her from across the road now looked up at her the way people look at weather. They finally understand. Aldous Brecht, Regional Director of Meridian Consolidated Livestock, sat in the third row with his collar buttoned too tight and a figure written on a piece of paper he kept folding and unfolding. And everyone in that hall knew the figure was a buyout offer, and everyone in that hall knew Maren Solberg was not going to take it. What they did not know was what she would do instead. She let the silence work for a moment, the way silence does when it has earned itself. Then she said 7 words, and what followed those 7 words changed the character of the Kellner Valley for a generation. But to understand those 7 words, you have to go back to the first Saturday of October 18 months before, which is where this story truly begins, though its real verdict had been passed long before she ever stood in that room. It was passed by the land itself, in the only language the land knows how to use, which is patience. She had driven up from the flatlands in a truck that sounded like it was working out a grudge with itself, pulling a horse trailer, empty of horses, because she could not afford horses yet, and was not sure she believed in the timeline where she could. Her name was Maren Solberg. She was 34 years old. She had $12,000 left to her name after the purchase of the Holt parcel closed. And the Holt parcel was 83 acres of hill ground on the eastern slope of the valley that had not grown anything notable since Raymond Holt's second back surgery had made the question of growing anything academic. The land came with a rotted equipment shed, a farmhouse that had been used by starlings longer than by people, and a standing offer from Meridian Consolidated, who had been buying up parcels in the valley for 3 years, and who had offered Raymond Holt $41,000 for 83 acres of hill ground, which Raymond Holt had accepted for reasons of his own, and which Maren Solberg had then purchased on a land contract from the Holt estate for $58,000, which still confused people who thought about it at any length. She had heard about the squash on the drive-up. There was a hand-lettered sign at the Peller Farm stand at the junction of County Road 9 and the State Highway that said F. Field Run Squash, Whole Lot, Massachusetts, Key, Offer. She had stopped because she was early for the meeting with the estate attorney and because she had the particular kind of curiosity that takes signs seriously. What she found behind the stand was 11 rows of blue Hubbard squash, enormous misshapen things the color of a frozen lake, that had been nipped twice by early frost, and that Greta Peller needed off her land before she could disc the ground for winter rye. Greta Peller was 61 and practical, and she told Maren Solberg that the squash were perfectly fine for stock feed, that a person could haul them for 40 cents per hundredweight, that there were approximately 38 tons of them, and that she, Greta Peller, had already had 3 neighbors look at them and decline. Maren Solberg stood in the row and picked up one of the squash, which was about the size and weight of a child's toboggan, and she turned it over in her hands and looked at it for a long moment. She put it down. She said, "I will take the lot." Greta Peller blinked twice, which was as close to astonishment as Greta Peller allowed herself in public. The transaction came to $304. The pigs were purchased the following week at the Danforth County Livestock Sale, which is where the laughing started in earnest. She had studied for 6 weeks before she ever set foot in that barn, reading everything she could find about heritage breed hogs, about foraging behavior, about the relationship between a pig's constitution and the quality of its winter feed, and she had settled on Ausabal Island hogs, a breed so old and so thoroughly out of fashion that the auctioneer, a man named Tully Breck, who had been calling livestock sales for 22 years, actually paused his patter and said into the microphone, "Well, we got a buyer for the Ausabals." Somebody write that down. There were 140 of them in 4 lots, mixed ages. The oldest a boar named by the consignor as Old Carl, who was the approximate size and temperament of a cast-iron stove. She paid $2,900 for all 4 lots, which was a price so low it was essentially the auctioneer rounding up from nothing. And when she backed her trailer up and began loading them, the 3 men sitting on the top rail of the pen regarded her with the studied amusement of people watching a comedy they have seen before. One of them, a man named Dale Furman who ran 500 Duroc sows over on the flat, and who wore this fact the way other men wore medals, called down to her that she had herself a fine collection of antiques and hoped she kept her receipts in case she wanted to return them. His friends found this funny. She did not look up from what she was doing. She drove home with 140 Ossabaw hogs, making their opinions known through the trailer walls, and a truck that had not changed its mind about its grudge. The arithmetic of it was this: she had 83 acres, $12,000, 38 tons of frostbitten blue Hubbard squash already loaded in the Peller barn, 140 hogs, and a winter coming. She had spent, counting everything, $3,204 on the animals and the feed, which left $8,796 to get through to spring. The farmhouse cost $400 to make tight enough to sleep in. The equipment shed cost $600, and a week of labor to make serviceable. She built the paddock fencing herself over 17 days with used steel posts and 4-strand wire, which she found she could do adequately, though her hands looked afterward as though they had lost an argument with something mechanical. The first month was the kind of hard that does not announce itself dramatically, but simply accumulates. She was up before light every morning to check the herd, which ranged across the hill ground in loose, purposeful groups. The Ossabaws moved differently from the commercial hogs she had read about. They moved with something that could only be called intention, rooting with a systematic patience that reminded her of someone looking for a thing they were certain was there. She began distributing the squash in sections of the field, splitting the great waxy gourds with a maul so the hogs could work into them. And the sound of 140 pigs engaged with a squash is a sound that has no adequate comparison in the civil world. She kept a ledger in the farmhouse, and she did the arithmetic every Sunday night by a lamp that made reading feel like a conscious decision. The numbers were not good, but they were not yet fatal, which she came to regard as a kind of progress. It was during the 3rd week of November that Maren Solberg came closest to something that was not quite despair, but was near enough to despair's neighborhood that she could hear its dogs. She had lost 4 shoats to a fence gap she had not found until morning. Not to anything catastrophic, but simply to their own wandering, and she had walked 2 miles of fence line in sleet to recover 3 of them, and had not recovered the 4th, and had stood at the edge of the hill ground in the dark and the wet, and looked at the number of days until spring, and felt the arithmetic close around her like a fist. She went back to the barn, and she sat down in the straw with her back against old Carl's pen board, and old Carl came and put his broad gray head on the rail, and looked at her with the ancient indifferent equanimity of a creature that has been doing this longer than memory. And she sat with him for a time, and the arithmetic did not change, somehow less like a fist and more like a problem, and problems have the structural decency of being at least theoretically solvable. It was the following Sunday that Leanna Voss first appeared at the gate on the lower road. Leanna Voss was 78 years old, had come to the Kellner Valley from Latvia 46 years ago, in circumstances she did not fully explain, and occupied a 12-acre place at the bottom of the hill that grew vegetables of unreasonable quality, and hosted, in Leanna Voss's words, very few visitors, and exactly as many as was needed. She came up the road with a jar of preserved plums, and stood at the gate with the particular patience of a person accustomed to having their arrival noted before the knock. Maren Solberg was mending the gap in the east fence, and looked up and waited. Leanna Voss said she had been watching the herd from the road for 3 weeks. She said she had not come sooner because she had wanted to see whether the woman up the hill would panic or whether she would watch. She said, in an accent that had been worn smooth by 46 years, but not worn away, "A thing can only teach you what it knows, and it will only teach you what it knows when you stop telling it what you already think you know. She held out the jar of plums. Marin Solberg took it, and they stood at the fence, and Lena Voss told her 3 things about Ossabaugh hogs that were not in any of the literature she had read, because they were the kind of knowledge that lives in observation and not in books. The first thing was about the way they communicated direction to one another through a particular change in gait when one animal found something worth finding. The second thing was about the quality of the fat they laid down on a diverse forage diet, how it was a different substance from the fat of a confinement animal, how it ran differently in the pan and held differently in the cold. The third thing she said was this: "The ground you are on has a spring in it that goes dry every August but is running full right now, and in 10 years I have never seen a person at this farm use it for anything except losing pigs to the mud." She pointed to a stand of iron-red grass on the north slope that marked where the moisture was. She said, "Watch where they go in the morning before they have their first feed." Marin Solberg watched. The hogs went to the iron-red grass every morning in the first light, as though they had always known. The boy arrived in December. His name was Theo Bachmeier. He was 9 years old. His mother washed laundry for 3 families in the valley, and his father was not a topic that was addressed. He appeared at the gate on a Saturday, with no stated purpose, and the quality of attention that very quiet children carry, the kind that makes adults feel they are being accurately assessed. He did not ask if he could help. He simply slipped through the gate and began doing small, useful things with an air of prior authorization. He named every pig in the paddock within a week, which he accomplished through a system of notation in a pocket notebook that she never looked at without permission. He called the oldest sow Marta. He called the second boar sergeant. He called a small white-spotted shote with an independent disposition Henrietta. And he called old Carl nothing, because old Carl, in Theo's considered assessment, already knew his name perfectly well and did not need to be told it. He came after school on the days the road was passable and did not speak more than was needed, and had, she noticed, a gift for the particular task of finding fence gaps before anything else did. The hogs grew through December and January in a way that the literature had prepared her for intellectually, but not viscerally. The Ossabaugh metabolism, shaped by centuries of boom and fallow on a sea island, was designed for exactly this condition: varied and imperfect forage, cold stress, sustained movement across rough ground. They did not merely survive the frostbitten squash. They converted it with a biochemical efficiency that was the product of genetics and time, and about which she had done nothing except refrain from interfering. The paddock smelled different from what she had expected. It smelled of turned earth and something faintly sweet that she could not name, which she later understood was the squash being worked into the soil in a way that was changing its texture and its capacity. She began recording observations in the ledger alongside the arithmetic. The weight gains she estimated by eye and by the way the scale at the feed store registered when she borrowed it on 4 occasions. By the first week of February, she believed what she was seeing, but was not yet ready to say so. The discovery was not dramatic. It came in mid-February on a Tuesday, when a man named Howard Schreier stopped his truck at her gate on the way back from a cattlemen's meeting in the county seat. Howard Schreier was 57, ran a heritage beef operation on 200 acres of bottom ground, and was precisely the kind of man whose opinion other men consulted before they formed their own. He had come, he said, to see what the smell was, meaning this as a joke at her expense, but he had to lean on the gate and look at the herd for 8 minutes without saying anything else first. And when he turned back to her, his expression had changed in the way expressions change when a man has had to quietly update a firmly held position. He said, "Those hogs are not what I would have expected." She said, "No." He said, "Where would you sell them?" She said she had a few ideas. He said, "I know a man in the city who does a charcuterie business. Heritage breeds, sells to 4-star kitchens, will pay a serious premium for the right animal." He gave her a card with a name on it, Anders Holm, and he said, I'm not saying anything I'm not prepared to stand behind." She thanked him and put the card in the ledger. She called Anders home the following morning. He came up from the city 2 weeks later, in a vehicle that looked unconvincing on a gravel road, and he walked into the paddock without being invited and spent 45 minutes in observation before he came back to the fence. He was interested in 18 animals now, and potentially in a standing arrangement for the following year and the year after. His offer for the 18 was $11,200, which was a price per hundredweight that she had to write down and look at twice to believe. She said she would need 48 hours. He said, "Take what you need," and handed her his card as though she had not already written his number in the ledger. She told no one. She banked the knowledge the way Lena Voss had once described keeping embers through a cold night, low and covered, and with just enough air to hold, because the moment for it was not yet, and she was learning to wait for the moment the land had already selected. The drought arrived in June without ceremony, which is how the worst things tend to arrive. By the end of June, the Kellner Valley had received 4 inches of rain in a period that historically delivered 16. By mid-July, the grass on the flat ground was the color of old rope, and the creek that ran through the valley's center was running at a third of its normal level, and the corn that Dale Furman and his neighbors had put in on the flat ground had begun to look less like corn and more like evidence. By the end of July, the temperature had not been below 93 degrees in 11 days, and the county extension agent had used the word disaster in a public meeting in a tone that suggested the word had been carefully selected for accuracy. Maren Solberg's heel ground, which was not flat ground and which was not planted to corn, and which had been turned and composted by 140 systematic and deliberate hogs for 8 months, held its moisture differently. The iron-red grass stand on the north slope was not green, but it was not dead. The spring ran thin, but ran. The soil that had been worked by the squash and the hog activity, and by what Lena Voss described as the ground, remembering how to drink, absorbed what little rain came and released it slowly, and the herd, whose entire evolutionary inheritance was calibrated for scarcity, continued to work the ground with the same purposeful patience they had demonstrated in October. Aldous Brecht had appeared first in March. He was 52, from the regional office of Meridian Consolidated in the city, and he wore his warmth the way a building wears insulation, as a functional layer designed to manage the transfer of something else. He had called ahead, which she appreciated mechanically if not substantively, and he had driven up in the Meridian truck with a logo on the door. And he had looked at the herd with the evaluative squint of a man performing appraisal rather than actually appraising, and he had said that Meridian was always interested in supporting independent producers who found themselves overextended, and that the land contract on the Holt parcel, while perfectly legal, represented a significant carrying cost, septed, and that Meridian would be prepared to offer her $64,000 for the 83 acres plus a per-head payment on the hog inventory, that he was authorized to set at $40 an animal. She had done the arithmetic while he was still talking. $40 a head on 140 animals was $5,600 and $64,000 for the land, and the land contract balance owed was still $39,000, which meant his offer would net her $30,600 in total and would leave her with neither land nor animals and nowhere to be. She told him she was not interested. He smiled the way men smile when they believe a no is a negotiating position, and said he would be in the area. He came back in May with a higher number, $68,000 for the land and $55 per head on the animals, and the number was not substantially different in its effect on her situation, and she declined again with the same words in the same tone, which she had noticed tended to unsettle people who expected the second refusal to require more effort than the first. He came back in early July, just as the drought was beginning to establish its true intentions, and this time he mentioned, in a tone of helpful concern, that there had been questions raised at the county planning office about the fence setbacks on her east line, and that he had heard there might be some paperwork involved, and that these things had a way of being complicated when a person was managing alone. She looked at him with the steadiness of someone who has been keeping embers alive under ash for 6 months, and said she appreciated the information and would look into it. The fence setbacks were legal. She had measured them herself against the county plat before the first post went in, and the planning office, when she called the following morning, confirmed there were no open inquiries on her parcel. She wrote down the date and what he had said in the ledger, because she had the instinct, which is what careful observation does to a person, that notes made now become useful later. The first person to come to her gate in the drought was Dale Furman. It was the 5th of August, and he came in the late afternoon when the light was going bronze and brutal over the flat ground behind him, and he stood at the gate with his hat in both hands, which was so unlike his ordinary posture that she almost did not recognize him for a moment. He had 180 sows in a confinement operation that was running on purchased corn that was now available at a price that had tripled in 6 weeks. He needed feed. He did not precisely have money in the quantity he needed because the corn price had eaten through his operating line, and his banker was, as he put it, adopting a reflective posture. He said he could offer her labor. He said his son could work 2 days a week through the fall, and he himself could contribute whatever physical skill she found useful. He said he understood if she said no. He said, and this cost him something, "I was wrong about what you were doing, and I should have known better, and I am asking for help." She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the flat ground behind him, and at the bronze, terrible light on it. She said, "Come back Thursday with your boy, and I will show you what I have and what it costs, and what I need in return, and we will work out the arithmetic together." He put his hat back on his head and nodded once and walked back to his truck, and she watched him go. Aldous Brecht called on the 12th of August, which was 11 days into a drought that the county had officially declared an agricultural emergency on the 8th. He did not come in person this time, but called on the telephone, which she noted in the ledger. His offer was for the full parcel and the full inventory and a 3-year supply contract or any future production at a price he described as extremely favorable. The number for the land was $74,000, which after the balance of the land contract would net her $35,000, and the animal payment was $65 per head on current inventory, which was now 131 animals. The 9 additional animals representing the natural attrition and addition of 18 months of operation. She calculated while he was talking that his total offer netted her approximately $43,000 in exchange for her 83 acres, 131 animals, 18 months of work, quote, unquote. And the knowledge that the land on the east slope of the Kellner Valley held moisture differently from the flat ground and had a spring on the north slope that ran in a drought year and had soil that had been worked into a condition of recovery by an unfashionable breed of hog fed on frostbitten squash. She said she was not interested. He said, "I'm trying to help you." She said, "I know." She said, "Good evening," and set the receiver down. It was Lena Voss who told her about the meeting. Not the Grange meeting which came later, but a smaller preliminary one at the Kellner Township Hall on the 14th of August, where Aldous Brecht had appeared without announcement to speak to 12 of the valley's remaining independent producers about what he called a regional stabilization arrangement. The stabilization arrangement involved Meridian Consolidated acquiring the feed resources and grazing rights of the farms in the valley at emergency prices, and redistributing them through a Meridian-managed protocol, which was Aldous Brecht's way of describing the process by which Meridian would buy cheap from the desperate and sell control to the captive at a margin that would survive the drought and outlast it. Lena Voss had gone to the meeting not because she was invited, but because she had walked past the open window and decided the window was as good a seat as any. She had heard Brecht cite a specific number. He said the Solberg operation on the east slope had approximately 200 tons of standing feed capacity remaining, which was a number that Maren Solberg had told no one and had not written anywhere that a visitor to her farm would see. Because it was an estimate she had made in the ledger, in the farmhouse in the first week of August, and had not shared with a single person, not Dale Fierman, not Anders Holm, not even Theo Bachmeyer, who she trusted as completely as she trusted old Carl. She opened the ledger to the entries for March, May, and July. She noted the dates of Aldous Brecht's 3 visits. She noted that the farmhouse was not locked during the day. She noted that the ledger sat on the same shelf each time, and that the entries were clearly legible. She did not feel the sharp thing this discovery might have warranted, because she was not a person who spent resources on feelings she could not act on. She felt instead the particular quality of attention that comes when you understand you are now holding information that someone else doesn't know you hold, which is the same quality Lena Voss had described when talking about the spring on the North Slope. It doesn't announce itself. It just runs. She sent word to the Valley families through Theo's mother, who knew everyone. The message was that she was hosting a meeting at the Kellner Grange Hall on the 22nd of August, and that any independent producer in the Valley who wished to discuss winter feed arrangements was welcome. She said no word to Aldous Brecht, but she was not surprised when he appeared, because a man of his habits does not miss a meeting where his interests are under discussion, and he is accustomed to shaping such meetings from within. He sat in the 3rd row. He had his piece of paper. He was, by Maren Solberg's estimate, carrying an offer in the range of $90,000, all in, which was a figure that had been climbing since March, and would, she also understood, be the last figure. Because Meridian's regional acquisition protocol had a seasonal deadline, and after the harvest accounting was closed for the year, the authority to make offers at this level would revert to the Home Office and take 6 months to reinstate. She had understood this from something Brecht himself had said in May, when he thought he was applying pressure and was instead supplying information to a person who wrote things down. The room was full. Dale Furman was there with his son, who was 17 and looked like his father, but without the certainty yet. Greta Peller was there from the farm stand at the junction. 6 other families, all of them with land and animals and the particular tight expression of people who have been doing arithmetic that does not balance. Lena Voss was there, at the end of a row, with the same posture she had brought to the gate in November, the posture of someone who came when they were needed and knew the difference. Theo Bachmeyer was there, small and still at the back of the room with his notebook open on his knee, recording, she understood, whatever he believed should be recorded. Aldous Brecht sat in the 3rd row and kept refolding his paper. She stood at the front of the room for a moment before she spoke, which was not theatrical hesitation but simply the habit of a person who does not begin until she is certain she has said what she is going to say the way it needs to be said. Then she said, "I have 200 tons of winter feed, and I am not selling it to Meridian." The room was so quiet you could hear the January wind at the caulking, except that it was August, and what you heard was the hot wind and the silence of people who had not allowed themselves to hope that sentence existed and were now hearing it. She said, "I am offering it to the Valley families at my cost of acquisition, which is 40 cents per hundredweight, plus labor in kind, because the squash did not hull itself and neither will this." She said, "The terms are that you bring your own wagons and your own backs, and you account your hours and you pay what the arithmetic says." She said, "No one goes without who is willing to work for it." She did not look at Aldous Brecht while she said any of this, though she was aware of him in the 3rd row the way you are aware of a door that is not quite latched. It was Brecht who stood up. He spoke in the tone of the reasonable man surrounded by sentiment, which was the tone he used when he wanted someone else to say the unsentimental thing on his behalf. He said that he wanted to make sure everyone understood that the offer he represented from Meridian was still on the table, that it was a serious offer from a serious company, and that the Valley families deserved to understand their options fully. He said that he was not sure what arrangement he was hearing described at the front of the room would prove workable given the quantities involved, and he said that he estimated those quantities at approximately 200 tons, which was his word, approximately. And he said it with the confidence of a man who believes his figure is better than anyone else's. She said 212 tons, as of Monday's count. She said it without inflection. She said, "I'm curious how your estimate landed so close to a number I have not shared with anyone in this room." She opened the ledger to August 7th and held it so that the entries faced the room rather than her. She said, "I keep careful records." She said, "I noted the dates of 3 visits to my farm when I was working in the paddock, and the farmhouse was not locked." She said, "I am not making an accusation. I am noting that a person whose figures match figures in a private ledger to within 6% has either arrived at that number independently, which would be an impressive piece of estimation from the road, or has had access to information that was not offered." Aldesbrecht sat down. He sat down the way a large structure settles, not suddenly, but in a way that revealed its weight had been structural all along. The room looked at him. The room looked at her. She closed the ledger. She said, "I am not interested in his offer. I am interested in whether the valley can get through this winter with its animals intact, and I believe it can. And I am proposing that we discuss the arithmetic together." She paused. Then she said the 7 words she had been carrying since she walked into the room. "A thing can only teach what it knows." She said it the way Eliana Voss had said it to her, in the November gate light, not as a quotation, but as a fact. She said, "This land taught me that frostbitten is not the same as finished. I am asking you to trust the same lesson." At the back of the room, Theo Bachmeier wrote something in his notebook, and she could see from the front of the room that he was satisfied with it, which meant it was accurate. Dale Furman stood up. He said, "I'll take the terms." He was not the kind of man who said things without knowing the room would follow, but he also was not this time using the room for cover. He said it because he meant it. And he sat back down. And then 5 families said yes in the following 2 minutes, and the 6th said yes before the meeting adjourned. Aldesbrecht stood and folded his paper once more, a final time, and put it in his breast pocket, and walked out of the Grange Hall into the August heat, and did not return to the Kellner Valley in any professional capacity that any of the Valley families were aware of. Because Meridian's regional acquisition protocol had other targets and other valleys, and a man of Brecht's institutional adaptability did not require a specific location in order to practice his particular skill. The rains came in the 2nd week of September, not dramatically but consistently, the way recovery often comes, a little at a time with no fanfare. The valley absorbed it the way the east slope had been absorbing imperfect moisture all year, with the ground's long institutional memory of what to do with water when it arrives. The corn did not come back. It had gone too far past retrieval. But the operations that had been kept intact through the feed arrangements were able to hold their animals through to spring. And what came out of the valley the following year was not the same valley that had gone into the drought, partly because of the drought itself and partly because of what the drought had made. The Osabas went to Andersholm's standing contract in the following spring, 61 animals at a premium that represented, when she closed the ledger and added the columns, an operating return on 18 months of work that she wrote down and then covered with her hand for a moment and then looked at again to make sure the addition was right. It was right. The land contract was paid off by the following November. The East Slope farmhouse, which had been used by starlings longer than by people when she arrived, now held a wood stove, a table, a good lamp, and a ledger system that had expanded to 4 volumes. The equipment shed held tools that were hers, purchased with earnings from a farm that worked the way she had believed a farm could work if a person paid the kind of attention that required patience rather than noise. Leanna Voss came up the hill the following October, 12 months after the Grange meeting, with a 2nd jar of preserved plums and the information that she had been right about the spring. The spring on the north slope had run through the entire drought without failing. It was running now. Leanna Voss stood at the fence and looked at the new cohort of young Osabas working the hill ground with their systematic and ancient patience, and she said, "The ground remembered how to drink because something taught it." She said it the way she said all things that mattered, which was, without drama and with full confidence, that the listener would take it at its proper weight. Marin Solberg looked at the iron-red grass stand that marked the spring, and at old Carl, who was still operating at the far end of the north paddock with the unhurried authority of an institution, and at Theo Bachmeier, who was crouched in the mud of the paddock with his notebook, recording the behavior of a shote who had discovered something beneath the frostbitten windfall apple that warranted serious documentation. She said, "Yes." She said it the way a person says the thing they have known for a long time and are finally saying aloud, not because the knowing required the saying, but because the saying was a gift you gave the moment once it had earned itself. Then she took the jar of plums, and they stood at the fence, and the valley below them was green with September rains, and the hill ground behind them was alive with the sound of animals that knew how to read a scarcity and come through it fat, and the ledger in the farmhouse was full of numbers that balanced, and the frost that was coming was not the end of anything, but the beginning of the next lesson, and the land, patient as it had always been, was already composing it.